Hello, everyone. We're very lucky today to have a real water expert to talk about the very critical issue today of resilient water management. This is a Georgetown conversation because Georgetown is situated in an island. It has beautiful water from lots of natural resources, but increasingly, it has to pipe in water from the mainland through the rivers. And the price of water is very critical for everybody. Now, what we want to do in this conversation is that the world is suffering from the pandemic. And basically, the virus is either water carried or air carried. And human beings live in both air and water. And so this is a conversation that we need to get some of the best minds to talk about this and its relationship with the whole. How should we deal with this from the perspective of water for the climate change problems that affect us all? We're very lucky today to have Dr. Alexander Zehnder, who is a Swiss professor. He studied chemistry and biochemistry in Zurich, one of the most famous universities in Switzerland called ETH. He did his postdoc at the University of Wisconsin, America, and was assistant professor at Stanford University, went back to University of Zurich, and today he not only works in Singapore, he was scientific director of water resources in Canada, but also consults and visiting professor at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. So welcome, Sasha. What we would like you to do is to give us a very quick overview of the importance of water historically for mankind and what are the biggest challenges today in the area of water.
Yeah, hello, Andrew. It is a pleasure to talk to you and to be part of this session. The importance of water, basically, there is no life without water, and everybody knows that. And whatever happens, at the end of the day, water is the real base of life on this planet. People have learned, humanity has learned early on that water is important, it has to be protected, and it has to be managed. On one side, as a resource, on the other side, when you use the water, you have to use it wisely. We can go back in history of humanity, and we know that in the Stone Age, people have been building villages on lakes because they needed the water for survival, but the water protected them also of wild animals. And human civilization actually started around water. We can go back to the ancient Egypt. We can go to China around the Yellow River. We can go to Mesopotamia or even to the Indus Valley in India and Pakistan. The big high cultures, or high civilizations, they all actually were organized around the water management, because these rivers had to be managed to feed the people, to give them the water for drinking. But basically, it was important for agriculture to produce food. So if we look what people need as water, it's very interesting. You can actually calculate how much water you need for drinking. We all drink maybe 3 liters of water. If you are in the tropics, it can go up to 9 liters of water. We calculate how much water this is. This is about 1 to 3 cubic meter per year. So it's very little, basically. But we need also water for our personal hygiene. And that adds up to about 20 cubic meter per person per year of water of relative high quality. But then we need also food. And food is actually which uses most of the water. And we can calculate how much water we need for producing our daily food. And when we calculate all together, we come to an order of magnitude of about 1,500 to 1,700 cubic meters per year. With that, you can feed the people, you can actually run the industry, people can actually have their personal hygiene, and they have enough water to drink. But it has to be clear that water doesn't need to have the same quality for all the 1,500 cubic meter. The highest quality is very clearly for drinking. Now, in most civilized countries, all these waters are produced out of water resources. In most places, 70 to 90% of the water comes from the groundwater, and only little come from surface water for the personal use for people. However, if you look to agriculture, most water, if additional water is needed, comes from rivers and lakes. However, if we look how much food is produced on the world and where the water is coming from for producing that food, we see that approximately 80% or 85% of the food is actually produced by rain-fed agriculture. So we don't have to add additional water through irrigation. And only 15% actually is produced through irrigation. And that's very clear because the rain doesn't cost anything. You don't need a infrastructure to bring the rain to the agriculture. The water in the soil, what we call the humidity in the soil, cannot be used for other things. So you have no competition for that water. It's so important. But in many places around the world where water starts to be limiting, we have to start to irrigate. And then we have to use the water resources, which otherwise are mostly used for our daily life, but also for the industry to function. So if you want to, basically the problem of water is at the end of the day are two things. The first is you need clean and safe drinking water because that keeps you healthy. But also you need water for agriculture. But that amount is much, much bigger. So if you want to, we eat the water. The largest amount is actually the water we eat. We call that water virtual water because it's not water anymore. It became rice, it became meat, it became vegetables. So it's actually that water which is used to produce this food is called the virtual water. Now, if we think about how we can get the water, we all talk about that we need the water and we have to pay for the water. But there we get into some problems of definition. What is the price of water? Water basically has no price. As oil has no price as long as it is underground, and if you can drill and get the oil out of the ground, it's almost free for you if you don't have to pay for the drilling equipment and the infrastructure. Everybody from us can go to a lake and take out a bucket of water, or from a river, take out a bucket of water. Nobody will charge you. So it's basically water per se is free. What the price is actually bringing the water to you 7 days a week, 24 hours at a high quality. You need to put infrastructures into the ground. You need to treat the water. And so to call that a price is difficult because in certain parts of this world, it's almost bound to the belief of the people that water is free. So it's actually not a price, it is a tariff. You pay for the service. You pay also for the gasoline. If you go to the pump, you have to pay for it, that it is transported to you, it is actually refined, and it is actually put into this place, and you have to pump to fill your tank up. So basically the price of your gasoline is also the price for the service you get. And the same thing is for the water. Now, water is much more emotional, and everything which goes around water has something to do with the personal feeling of most of the people. And when we look in all religions, water plays a key role. Without water, there is no religion, because water has the cleaning factor. It cleans your soul, it makes things proper. It actually is, in many cases, almost fire and water. What we say doesn't go together. When we know that two people cannot get along, we say it's fire and water. But fire and water comes up in human civilizations, human beliefs, in our culture, always comes somehow together. On the one side, you have the fire, on the other side, you have the water. And we can go to the Chinese culture in Taoism. Fire and water are extremely important elements in the Taoism. In the circular way of how life and the earth is functioning. We have the water in Christianity. We have water in the Muslim belief, because Allah's empire is built on water. So water has this very emotional aspect. And that's why when you treat issues of water, it doesn't help you to be just intellectually arguing about water. You have to touch the soul of the people if you want to discuss issues of water with them. So people do understand through water what equity is. They do understand what it means that everybody should have a right on getting the water. Very often it's said that water is basically, in the 21st century, the element you're gonna fight about. So as oil was in the 20th century, kind of the element to fight about it, the 21st century will be water. Now we can go back to Mark Twain, who said, well, whiskey is for drinking and water is to fight over. It's not as simple as that, because if you have some issues in the discussions between nations, but also between neighbors, if it is only water, we have learned in the past that mostly people mostly find a way to deal with it, because everybody knows what that means, not having water. However, if the water is part of another thing, like kind of the power game, as we have it in many river areas, then it becomes more complex, because as long as water is only part of it, it will not bring people to actually think and feel about it, because having the control over land, having the control over other resources, having the control over cities, water is then playing only a smaller part. And then water can be actually an element which actually increases even the power struggle. So it's very interesting. Also, if you start to build pipelines, for example, to bring water from one place to the other, people are actually open to take that. However, if it touches something else, then you have to make sure that everybody is included in the discussions. So if the people are not fully in the discussion and you don't explain them to you, they become kind of reluctant. They will not believe you. Water experts can sing you a song of that. If you are not sure, if you not make sure that everybody is included, if the discussion is not fully inclusive, you will run into issues when you want to find solutions for water. Because It does not touch primarily your intellect. It touches your feelings and emotions. And that makes it, on one side, complicated if you have to implement some solutions. On the other side, it makes it also very, very exciting to think about it, because we very often make simple calculations. And these calculations don't work in the world of the water, the simple calculation. It has always to be bound to something which humans do. Now take, for example, the start of our civilizations. In Egypt, we had a pharaoh, and the pharaoh was basically a god. And the main task of the pharaoh was to distribute the water from the river Nile for drinking, hygiene, but also and specifically for the production of the food. We have probably all heard about that in June, the river Nile kind of flooded whole Egypt and brought in all the nutrients which were needed then later for the agricultural production. Now, to make sure that everybody got enough water and enough from that fertile river mud, somebody had to control the river flow, had to make sure that everybody gets the fair share of it. And as long as the pharaoh was able to do that, he was accepted by the people as a god. The moment he couldn't or she couldn't do it, they became into political troubles. Now, the pharaohs had also a huge advantage because they had the whole priesthood who actually brought all the messages about how the water has to be managed down to the people. So he had a direct connection between what he was saying to where the people were working in the field. And that went through the belief. Now, this was, we could say nowadays, easy because God's word were actually believed and they were not questions. Now people in the meantime, not everywhere was the same, but now people became a little bit more critical, and we don't have any heads of states anymore who are gods and can actually command. Now we have to convince the people. Now we have to think about. We have to actually understand what actually the water means at the heart of everybody here on the globe. So if you take it together, you have water as the basis of life. It's actually a resource. It's dealt with now in modern life, in the civilized or developed country. You have the water as a commodity. It's a commodity, and you pay for it, you get the commodity. You don't pay for it, you don't get the commodity. Now, what's in my discussions with governments, and also local organization, the question comes always up. Yes, the price of water, or better, as we said, the tariff you have to pay for the water, depends on who is taking over the costs for actually producing the water and cleaning the water and bringing to the different houses. And if you take it from that part, you say, then who pays for the initial investment? It's basically, for water, it's the same thing we do for most other investments also. The community or the government, depends on how big you are, is actually paying for the infrastructure, for the initial infrastructure. States and central governments are paying for roads. But there's always a discussion that actually you should not pay for the water infrastructure because people should pay for it. I think this is a wrong approach. If we look in specifically poorer country where this is a big issue, the poor people cannot make the investment for the infrastructure. However, as I said before with the numbers, the amount of water, that means 1 cubic meter or 20 cubic meter per capita, that can be paid over a year. That's no problem, because the poor people do actually pay much more for the water than they would if the central government would actually invest in building the infrastructure. When they go to this the street vendor for water, they pay a lot of money for a liter of drinking water or a buck of water, and that the central government can make it cheaper. The problem is that you have to make huge investments. The numbers look crazily high. And I can just give you one example from Switzerland, that actually the water infrastructure, the cost to replace the entire water infrastructure is about double of what it is for the railway infrastructure. And in Switzerland, the railway is very, very highly developed, and the roads. So actually, all the water infrastructure we have on the ground is a huge amount of bound capital. And you don't see it. The roads you see, you can go on it with your car. You can go on the railways and be transported around the country. But the water is, we have all used since we are children. We go to the tap, turn it on, and the water comes out. And to make that clear to the political decision makers, that actually this is comparable, totally comparable, that people or the community should actually pay for the initial investment, and then through tariffs they actually pay for the treatment of the water and for the replacement of the infrastructure. Now, in many places around the world, when the discussion was about the privatization of the water, it's actually interesting why in most places it didn't work. It should. There is no reason, because if the central government puts in the infrastructure and then you have a private company who runs it and actually asks the tariffs to also for the replacement, there should be no issue at all. But mostly it's so that the governments in the beginning, they do subsidize also the use of water. That means that you pay almost nothing. If you give it now to a private industry, that private industry has to make the calculation is how much do I have to for the need for the investment, how much I need for the treatment, how much I need to put for the security of the water in difficult cases, and so on and so on. And that gives you together a certain price or a certain tariff per cubic meter of water. And then people are shocked. All of a sudden, the price has doubled, tripled, or it's became even 10 times higher. And then they go in the streets. And what happens then is that the political powers actually don't like to have people in the streets protesting, so they actually adjust the price. They adjust the price in such a way that actually the people are happy again. But with that price you pay for the infrastructure and the water delivery, the private sector cannot do it. It's just not possible. We have very interesting cases in that. Argentina is classical, almost classical. The French companies came in and said, we're going to run your water infrastructure. It was all good. The price went up. People in the streets, the political power corrected the price down. The company said, that's it. We cannot do it for it. Or other things like maybe some of you remember when the railway system in Great Britain was privatized. What happened after about a year or two is that the infrastructure actually started to deteriorate, because the private sector optimized kind of the income from the railway, and nobody told them actually to repair the infrastructure. And so it had to be changed now in most places where actually the privatization functions somehow, is that the running of the infrastructure and the production can go to the private sector. However, the replacement has to go through central governmental organizations. So in the railway system in Great Britain, now the government is actually paying for the infrastructure. It's the same thing here in Switzerland. It's many places around the world. It's very clear that the government has to pay for the infrastructure. And the running of the system is then in private hands. For water, this is not yet clear because we have different ways of managing water around the world. We have places like the Netherlands, Switzerland, but also the US. Largely, they have very small water factories, if you want to. The supplier of water is mostly local, as is the wastewater treatment. So we have 3,000 different water suppliers here in Switzerland. In the US, it's huge. It's almost every village has its own, or the city has its own, but also the village has its own organization for supplying the water. The same thing is in Holland. In Great Britain, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit different because they have water company. We have all heard of them. And if you go, for example, then the other extreme, so Singapore is small, but Singapore has a central water delivery and wastewater treatment. So everything is done centrally. So you have around the world different ways of approaching the water issue. If you distribute it to the community, the degree of organization of the community needs to be very high. If the management and the way you actually deal with resources is not really dealt very well at the local level, we have to go to more centralized systems. Now, the question is, and we have all these debates between those making the investments, the scientists, the engineers, should we actually decentralize our water system? Because then the water issue is very close to the people, which they do understand. And from an emotional part of view, this is a good way because you actually bring it down to those who are directly exposed or have to deal with it. On the other side, when you need to have the water delivery 24 hours, 7 days a week, it becomes a little bit more complicated because then you have to work your 3 days, you have to make sure that also at night the water is flowing. So that actually has more the tendency to go to central water systems. Now in the drinking water area, very often in the developed world, in the highly developed world, the drinking water system is also coupled to the fire water, which we always forget. And fire water means you need, within a very short period of time, you need a lot of water. If you have a fire, you better have the water immediately at your disposal. Now that means that your infrastructure or your pipes have to be much bigger than you would need for just for the drinking water and the normal use of the water, because you need that for these kind of cases when you have a crisis, which means when a house or a whole blocks are burning, you need a lot of water and it has to be there. So that's probably better managed by a more centralized system. But the experience is, so kind of city-wise, as long as the water is actually managed on the city level, that's about probably the optimal way. If it goes to smaller places, then you have to think about whether you want to do it yourself or pay for a pipeline coming to your village and distribute it. But that you cannot say it is only one way to solve. It has to do with the geographical place where you are. It has to do with the geology which is around you. So you have to make sure that actually all these points are taken into account for your decision. Maybe one last word on water in the sense of privatizing water. If we looked at so we all run around with plastic bottles and water in there. So we are fighting against the plastic, but it's extremely convenient that you can go to the shop and buy drinking water in the bottle. And we all know it from traveling. We go to certain places where we are not very sure about the quality of the water. We buy the bottled water because we are sure this is safe water to drink. Now, there are a few big companies around the world who, who have figured out that quite a long time ago that actually if you can control the water market, the drinking water market, and specifically this convenient part of the drinking water, that's a good business model. And that all works well as long as there is enough water for everybody. If you have a drought in an area where these companies are actually extracting water out of the ground or from a lake or from a river, you run into huge problems because the farmers cannot understand why they are not allowed to irrigate their fields. And the trucks with all the bottled water are passing by every day, every hour, and that water is transported away. Now, if you make your calculation, what they transport away is a small part of what the farmers would use. So it basically has no big influence on that. However, now comes the emotional aspect. This is our water. This is the water where we live. This is our water. This water is brought away. And nobody is going to listen to your calculation and the argumentation. It is not feasible. And we have many examples around the world where during drought period, actually these companies, some of these global companies had to close down their production sites, and they are not coming back because of that. Now, how can you, because we still need to be able to distribute that water, the bottled water. Some people say we don't need it, but living in several parts of the world, this argument doesn't really be so important because at the end of the day, we need that water not only for convenience reasons, but also for safety reasons. So my experience is it works then when you are fully inclusive. When you are as a company, you build your production side. When you're fully exclusive with everybody around, you're open, you're totally transparent. But not only the moment the crisis arises, but actually you have to start it long before, because water issues are issues of trust. If you're not building up that trust, you have to close down your water factory. Now, perhaps an interesting issue about water when we look to the industry. Industry or the financial, the finance officers, they calculate the water they have to pay per cubic meter. And then they make kind of a calculation of how much the water is in the total production area or in the production of the company. And very often the water is actually negligible. It's very small. However, if you do the calculation, what happens if we don't have the water? Then all of a sudden, this risk factor increases drastically. And the price may be actually much higher at the end of the day than what you just calculate from the use of the water. And many industrial complexes learned that the hard way. Water has to be taken into account, and you have to actually multiply the price by the risk your production is shut down because of the lack of water. And this also, these water companies who are actually selling the water in bottled form, they had to learn that the hard way. Other industrial processes had to learn it the hard way. And there is two ways out of it. The one way is that your production line doesn't use water. So you actually shift from a water consuming production line to a non-water consuming production line. Then that's the best thing. You're totally off the hook. If something happens, you can produce further. But that needs initial investment, and who likes to put in money just for something you're not really sure will happen. The second thing is that you are fully recycling your water. That means you are using the water several times, the same amount of water. And what you see is really a development in the direction now that you go more and more into these recycling systems. That actually the industry, the total amount of water which is used for industrial production actually is drastically limited by reusing the same water again, and again. For that, you need technology to actually produce good quality water, and that's a nice thing for researchers and for the engineers to actually build intelligent systems, how you can actually reuse the water and how you can do that most efficiently with at least of energy use in total.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a little bit kind of a roundup of what the water issue is all about.
Thank you. What I've learned from you, this is a very wise, powerful presentation. It's the best exposition of water issues. It is not only physical, it's actually emotional. And it is a very important public good. Right, my understanding of water has come from three sources. The first one was that the Incas built their civilization on the proper irrigation of water, right? And the Mayas disappeared because of that. And then the second experience was Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat came because it was a water-based irrigation, then it produces the rice fields, and then they spent so much on the temples, they neglected the canals, mosquitoes came, the population died, and then the civilization collapsed and disappeared back into the jungle. Then the third one is the Balinese water culture. The Balinese water culture actually learned it from the Indians, presumably, but actually if they manage that water well, it fertilizes the rice fields, it waters the rice fields, and it kills the insects at the same time. So you don't need chemical fertilizers or chemicals to kill the insects. Water is very much part of culture. And what actually all these tells me is that when we had the well water, the well was the community. When everybody comes to the well to exchange information, and discuss on what is good or bad for the society as a whole, and that engenders trust. But then when we deliver water right to the house, we don't need to go to talk to our neighbor. And then we delegate it down the line. And then we forget in this linear structure, the circular economy, that we can actually recycle our water rather than waste it, right? But you raise also a very important point, which is that in the management of water, we have a peak and sudden stop problem, right? Exactly as you say, if you centralize, you deal with the peak. But if you don't centralize, and when you have a sudden stop, the whole system stops. Or if you centralize by putting all the water source from one lake or reservoir, and that reservoir finishes, the whole community is dead, right? Unless you are able to pipe the water from somewhere else or get a new source. So water is a very unifying, and increasingly as we live together, it becomes a disputatory. Water disputes are now getting into everybody's problems, because exactly as you say, if you dam up a river, not just to use the water, but to produce power, people down the river are going to die. I mean, because they run out of water, and ability to cycle things. So what you've done is to bring all these, and what it really means is that if we don't address this issue right at the heart of the way we think about our way of living in managing climate change, which is going to change the whole weather patterns and the water flow patterns, right? It will be existential. And how do we get this conversation? Because it's not just talking to a few politicians or to have the fashion of having privatization. It's far more complicated, right? And so what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, you brought forward a few interesting points. And my thoughts about the climate change is that we have only also IPCC. So that's the organization of the UN who makes all this prediction and calculations of how the climate is changing and so. They have only late understood that at the end of the day, the first impact of climate change is on the hydrological cycle. And it's only since about one or two reports they actually started to build that in. So at the end of the day, it is on one side, it's the climate change triggered by all our activities, including all the greenhouse gases and the story we all have heard about. But the first effect of climate change is on the hydrological cycle. And it may be droughts, but it may be also floods. What we have learned in the past is that if we take that the water cycle becomes faster, rain events may become more severe. But at the same time, in different parts of the world, we actually see that we get longer drought periods. Now, it is not entirely new to humanity that we go through this kind of flooding and drought cycles. And historically, human societies have started to adapt it. As you say, building dams, retaining water, but making sure there is enough water downstreams. Having specified agriculture, which actually allowed more water to infiltrate into the ground when rain events happen, and then you can stay longer without water. We have basically quite a lot of knowledge built up over the thousands of years of human civilization. But what we see now is that the difference is becoming much bigger, something we have never ever experienced in a very short period of time. Now, from my own work, we did some calculations and looked at the climate change models and to see whether we can actually do the same amount of agriculture in the future as we did up to now. Interestingly, what you see is that you see a shift in rainfalls. There where we have been used with a large amount of rain for the agriculture, where agriculture could actually run entirely on rain-fed agriculture. There you may actually run into problems like the southern part of the Midwest in the US. However, because the amount of water turning around on the globe is actually everything which goes up in the atmosphere comes down somewhere within a year's period. So it doesn't mean that we have less water. We may even have more water in the atmosphere, but it will not fall down there where you actually need it and where your fertile grounds are. But interestingly, we will have probably a shift in rainfall pattern in northeastern China, where all these kind of black soils, which are entirely fertile, but couldn't be used in full because of the lack of water. Climate change may actually shift certain agriculture into this area. In North America, the shift will be from the southern US more into Canada, in the prairies from Canada, because it will become warmer, so the temperature will be high enough for the plants to grow. And another hotspot is Argentina. The Pampas will get, based on all the models, and models are not predictions, but they are just scenarios, more likely scenarios and less likely scenarios. But with all the more likely scenarios, the Pampas in Argentina will become more you can produce more agriculture goods because you will have more water. However, you have also areas where it's a catastrophe. and that's mostly India. India has been shown in all these models that actually the rainfall pattern with the monsoon changing, the rainfall pattern will become so that you have more droughts. The monsoon will probably not bring the humidity it had brought before. So you will have losers and winners around the globe. One step in the adaptation is probably that we have to learn that water is a common good of humans on the entire globe, and that geopolitical disputes have no place in the future world when it comes to water and food. And you can very easily replace lacking water with food import when you cannot produce your agriculture goods. And we have good examples, like Singapore is not enough, it has not enough land, but it has also not enough water, and it compensates by food import. Israel imports huge amount of food. They export a little bit of the high-end cost production, but the low-end cost production, it's all imported. And if you look at it's almost the same amount of water which the country has at its disposal for everybody in the country is actually imported food. So it's about 50-50. So half of the water is actually virtual water, which is imported. So we have to start to become more flexible, and we have to understand that we can actually deal with the climate change on the large extent on a global, that we can actually compensate the lack of water with food. And if you make all the calculations, we have still enough good agricultural land to produce actually food for everybody. However, not at the diet we are used to.
That's right.
Because on this calculation, you see very clearly that the production of meat is actually using more water than 10 times more water than if you take rice or corn or something else. So as long as the shift has to go to less meat. When we look kind of in the developed world, we all use probably about 30% of the total energy intake, 35. In many places, it's even 40% of the energy intake is in form of meat. That's not feasible anymore. So it doesn't mean that we have to eat everyday meat, but once a week would be enough. That's what we need, but that's enough. So by shifting that, we actually do use less water. We can actually do more with the water we have if we just go to a more vegetarian type of nutrition. So it's not only for your own health to become more vegetarian, it's actually helpful for the total global community if people start to shift in this direction. And the calculations show that you could easily feed 10 billion people on this globe. However, you have to make sure that the food goes there where people need it and where people are hit by the global change of the hydrological cycle. So that's one thing. We have to become the global village. We have to become basically the global community. If we are not doing that, we run into problems, or certain parts in the world do run into problems, and we have that already. It's already there. We see in certain parts of Africa, or you look in Yemen, what happens there. So it's the war, the exchange of the food and the water is not helping anymore. People are dying. It's very clear what's happened if you are not learning it. And historically, you mentioned the Mayas. Tikal had to close down because the water quality was not there anymore, and they had a few years of drought, and people were dying of hunger, and nobody believed the king anymore. So that was it. It was over. Very classical example. We have good examples through the human history, actually, how we have to do it. We have to, and the other point is, so we have to become a more global community. And water and water issues, and food is part of it, should not be controlled through geopolitical power games. Because if you do that, then you get crazy things that what we have seen in Libya, that actually the groundwater, which is 10,000s of years old, are pumped out just to make agricultural production, because we stopped. They were not able to import food anymore and feed their people. And when the bread price,
Right.
it's like the water price, a very sensitive thing. The bread price goes up. That's it. That's the revolution in the countries. On the other side, it's important that we actually, through education, make clear to all our children what that means to have enough water, what that means to have high quality of water, and that we all have to find a solution for the community. And egoism in its most strict appearance has no place anymore in a world where global change is actually starting to impact the society as a whole. So we have to think more communal. And I know around the world, it is everywhere, it's different. We go to Africa, it's the village. That communal thinking is there. When we go to Asia, it's more communal thinking than it is, for example, in the Western part. So in Europe, you still have some communal thinking, but if you go to the United States, it becomes very individualistic. The more individualistic you become, the less fit you are to actually deal with what global change is actually triggering in our societies. And the interesting thing at the base of all that is water.
Well,
if we are able to run the water in a good way, in a communal good way, everybody will win. It's just a win-win situation, and we can screw it up if we are not doing it.
Sasha, this is brilliant, and it really very wise. You've summed up for me some of the common issues that we face. The issue is that you brought up that there is a hydrological cycle. There is also an energy cycle. There is an air cycle, the water currents, the air currents, right? The energy cycle, the magnetic cycle. All these are part of the global interconnectivity and interactivity that is so fundamental to our survival, and yet the wisdom on this has been lost, because we cannot fit it all together, right? And that's what we now need to do, not just fit it all together for us, the retiring generation, but for the young ones who must get it now. If they don't get it, we could end up with blown up or completely, run out of water or something else, right? So thank you very much, Sasha. We have run out of time, but we will carry on this conversation, because after we have done the conversations on water, on food, on urbanization, on infrastructure, on epidemiology, on the thinkings and finance, we'll fit it all back together into a communal conversation in which we hope that we will be able to advance our thinking on what we need to buy time in this very complicated world. So thank you very much, Sasha, and we'll carry on this conversation.
Sure, Andrew. Thank you also to give me the possibility and the opportunity to explain some of these water issues, which I personally find extremely exciting. That's why I'm working in this area. And once you start with it, you don't give it out of the hands anymore. You almost stick with it. So it was a pleasure to talk to you about that.
Thank you very much, Sasha. It shows in your passion over the subject and also your mastery of it. And that's very critical, because our listeners, a lot of them don't understand this, or they don't know how to fit it within the global context. And once we begin to fit the jigsaw puzzle together, suddenly we have a picture of how to move in this new complicated world. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, thank you also.